What we commonly see is that in the sub-premium and the premium segments, almost all of the trace minerals come from organic sources because those are the premium offerings that are available. They deliver the highest quality, but they also come at the highest price, which is why for sub-premium and premium, those are the ones you see. And when it comes to the economic lines, in those particular cases, you sometimes more often see the inorganics still being used.
Hello and welcome to the Pet Food Science Podcast, where our goal is to share emerging science that informs innovation in the pet food industry and best practices so we can maintain that innovation now and into the future. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Shoveler, and I'm here today with Dr. Gavin Boerboom. Gavin is originally from the Netherlands and got his master's degree in human food sciences from the University of Maastricht. He joined Trouw Nutrition Research and Development in 2016 after finishing his master's degree focusing on the development of new feed additives, improving performance and digestion. In 2018, he combined this role with a PhD at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, focused on trace mineral nutrition in monogastric animals, which he finished in 2021. Upon completion of his PhD, he joined the Celco USA organization in January of 22, supporting the mineral business in North America and beyond. He moved with his wife to Guelph, Canada, working out of the Trouw Nutrition Canada office. And his role today, he supports the Salesforce team on their discussions with the bigger integrators in US and Canada. In July of 22, he joined the global Celco team as a global program manager of trace minerals, extending his responsibility for technical support beyond North America and focusing on the monogastric business in the EU and the Middle East. Welcome, Gavin.
Thanks for having me, Kate.
Well, I'm really excited to have you. I know quite a bit about Trouw Nutrition, but I think we have a really great opportunity today to really get into some trace mineral nutrition and metabolism. So I thought maybe we should start with a definition of the classes of different trace minerals that Trouw Nutrition and other companies offer to the pet food industry.
Yeah, so this is one of the questions we obviously get a lot. And I think one of the things that we notice is that it can be a jungle for a lot of folks that don't deal with it on a daily basis. Basically, the groups are the inorganics, the organics, and then the hydroxys. And I consider the hydroxys to be different than the first two, and I'll explain a little bit why. In the inorganics, I think the two most well-known ones are the oxides and the sulfates. They're very commonly being used due to their, let's say, low price and ease of use. And then in the organics, that's a broader term for a multitude of different products or complexes. Can either be complexes or chelates. And the most well-known groups in there are the amino acid complexes, the glycinates, or the proteinates. And then the hydroxys are a different form, which they have, let's say, a more stable complex as well, like you would see with the organics, but they don't have an organic ligand. They're basically hydroxychlorides, which allows them to be as efficient as organics or close to, but they don't have the bigger ligand that they need to have, or at least have the mineral attached to, which allows you to at least have a larger amount of metals attached to it.
84 million times a day, pets eat meals with ingredients from Trouw Nutrition. We bring together the science of ingredients, nutrition, and blending to unleash possibilities for pet food brands. Premixes are just the start. Turn to Trouw for higher inclusion ingredients too, like proteins and carbohydrates, and highly sensitive ingredients like probiotics. With our palatants and base blends, you can feel confident about what comes in our bags and goes in yours. Learn more at TrougNutritionPets.com.
Okay, fantastic. So when we think about those three different categories, then, Gavin, if we first and foremost, maybe the pet food industry would probably be interested in how those are labeled. And let's maybe start there before we dive in to how they're physiologically processed.
Yeah. So the inorganics are labeled as sulfates or as oxides. In the organic space, it depends a little bit on what they are bound to. Some of them are labeled as amino acid complexes because in those particular cases, it is linked to a specific amino acid. And some of them are also labeled as chelation complexes. In some areas, we can see them being labeled or along the lines of hydrolyzed protein. But in most cases, those are the most common ones that we see in the business. And it comes to the last one, the hydroxys. Those are usually labeled as hydroxychloride sources.
Okay, so with that, when you look at your customer sales today, where do you see the majority of the pet food industry purchasing in? Are they purchasing in the organic or the inorganic categories, or a little combination of both? And maybe why would one company choose one over the other broadly?
What we commonly see is that in the sub-premium and the premium segments, almost all of the trace minerals come from organic sources because those are the premium offerings that are available. They deliver the highest quality, but they also come at the highest price, which is why for sub-premium and premium, those are the ones you see. And when it comes to the economic lines, in those particular cases, you sometimes more often see the inorganics still being used, but that's highly dependent on the area in the world that you're in as well. For some cases, even in sub-premium or premium, you see the usage of inorganics pop up as well.
Interesting. So to underpin that, it must not only be the cost of the production of those minerals, which is a factor in its overall cost, but how those minerals, those trace minerals, are then digested and absorbed. So could you maybe, and this is going to be pretty big, so let's maybe just talk about first how inorganic minerals are digested and absorbed in contrast to chelated minerals as well, or complex minerals.
So one thing to keep in mind is that when you consider production cost, you also need to consider size of the ligand that you are attaching them to. So that's one thing I want to clarify maybe before I go in depth on the digestion of these inorganic sources. Because when you use a bigger ligand, molecular speaking, obviously you can load relatively lower amounts of metal on there. That is one of the main reasons why there's such a price gap between these different sources of minerals, because the relative amount of mineral you get with the same amount of product simply differs substantially. At the end of the day, from a formulation perspective, you obviously formulate towards active metal, which means that for some products, you need to use more in comparison to other products. So that's a small clarification with regards to that one. With regards to digestion, the thing that your inorganics suffer from the most is that their strength of the complex is very weak. What that basically means is that when it is ingested, it can fall apart, basically loosening the bond between the ligands and the metal, which means your metal becomes free and soluble. And as soon as a metal becomes free and soluble, it starts to react with whatever it can find, because basically a metal always wants to be bound. I always like to imagine the gastrointestinal tract as an area where there is a massive tug of war going on, where you have a lot of things pulling on these metals trying to get it. Now, I indicate obviously that when these inorganic are consumed, this complex can fall apart, but you also obviously have to consider the fact that during production of feed, the same principle adheres, which especially when you extrude feeds where you have a high temperature and a high moisture content, there is already some dissociation between these complexes happening, meaning that you get a free metal even before the animal takes the bite of feed or
Okay. I think maybe just for the audience as well, I'm quite familiar with it because I know a couple of your colleagues at Trouw who also refer to minerals as metals, but you are commonly referring to trace minerals as metals. And I just wanted to make sure that our listeners understand that that's how you're describing minerals. And it might actually be new information for a lot of people. For them to actually know that most minerals are metals. And so when you talk about reactivity, and we're going to get into that a little bit as we go along, is very important. So I want to circle back a little bit to something that you stated earlier that I think is important, which is you talked about formulation targets and formulation approaches when using either inorganic or organic trace minerals. Can you expand a little bit more on the formulation targets and why, and break it down a little bit more simplistically for the listeners?
Yeah. So one thing you have to consider when you take into consideration these trace mineral levels is that trace minerals and their requirements are very dependent on the species. To a large extent, they're driven by the needs of the animal, and those needs are to a large extent driven to the surroundings these animals are in, or the age that these animals are. So it's very important to, at the beginning of this journey for yourself, to define what animals you're dealing with, in what sort of scenario these animals live, what their age is, and all these very important factors take, to a large extent, determine, I should say, what the trace mineral requirements can be. And that's also one of the reasons why it's so hard to define what the requirements are for all these different animals. Now, that this is especially the case for companion animals. But even on the production animal side, trace mineral requirements are still very hard to define, because if I take a very young bird or a very old bird, they will have both different trace mineral requirements. But if I put said bird in a very healthy environment versus the same bird in an unhealthy environment, their requirements will still be very different. Now, that obviously makes it even more complex for dogs and cats, because they're genetically not all identical. On the production animal side, they're genetically, especially for the broilers, quite identical. But even in those cases, it's already hard. So if you then translate that one to companion animals, it becomes even harder to then define what these requirements are.
Yeah, and I think when we think about targets, I think this is, and your points about nutrient requirements, it's a really good time to remind everybody in the pet food industry that regulatory requirements do not speak to formulations that make targeted diets appropriate for certain animals. And to your point, it's quite important to think about the diet that you're making, the dogs and or the cats that are going to consume that diet, and whether they have any physiological, whether that stage of life or physiological conditions that might alter their needs for different minerals. I might add too, I think you probably know quite a bit about this too, is that there is really a dearth of information on the empirical estimations of mineral requirements in dogs and cats as well. So it really puts an onus on the pet food companies and the ingredient suppliers to consider these very, very deeply before launching a commercial diet. So your point is well taken. So when you think about, if correct me if I'm wrong, maybe I'll take a stab at this. And you're going to get the chelated parts that are going to come in with your organic trace minerals, but pound for pound, you're going to deliver far less trace mineral with your organic minerals than you are with your inorganic minerals.
On a kg to kg basis, yes, you are correct.
Okay, so you're going to be using micro amounts of the inorganics and proportionately more of the organics, correct?
From a product perspective, yes, but from a mental perspective, the formulation will be identical, or a mineral perspective.
Okay, got it. So when we go down, so now we're going to circle back again a little bit to the digestion process because intrigued because we're also using some trace minerals such as zinc as replacements for antibiotics in some of our agricultural animals. So
Yeah.
part of that is that it's also staying a little bit in the gastrointestinal tract. So can you speak to the differences in supplying inorganic and organic on how it influences the gastrointestinal tract?
Yes. So basically, as already alluded to earlier, what the problem you have with the inorganics is the fact that they fall apart relatively fast. That's particularly the case for sulfates. For the oxides, it depends a little bit on the quality of the oxide that you are using. Zinc oxide is less soluble than zinc sulfate will be, which means that the part of the zinc oxide complex that does not become soluble has a larger tendency of sticking together. It only it only falls apart when you get it into its soluble state. So that's a distinction that everybody should be aware of when you consider oxides versus sulfates. When it comes to the organics, it all depends on, let's say, what the metal or mineral is complexed to. Now, what I mean by that, and again, the reference of the tug of war, if you take a very small ligand, which is the case for example, the glycinates, in those particular cases, you will have your metal attached to a glycine, which is a very small amino acid, and the relative chelation affinity of glycine towards a zinc, manganese, copper, or any of the other minerals is relatively low. What that means is that the likelihood that that complex will stick together is lower than what you would have with, say, a different amino acids, such as methionine. Now, the thing is, and that's how you can distinguish these different organic sources that are being offered, is by taking a close look at the ligand that they're using to create the complex, because that in the end determines the stability of the complex and thereby will determine how it will behave as soon as it gets into a digestive system. That's step number one, I should say. Because as soon as a metal is digested, you have to realize that it has to go through the stomach, which is a very acidic environment. And the stronger that complex is, the more likely it is to stay together. Now, when it stays together, for example, with a proteinate, because you're using a mixture of peptides, the complex that is being formed is very strong in reality because you're using a mixture of peptides or different amino acids. So it's a survival of the fittest approach where the complex that is being formed is a connection that is multifold rather than single-fold. And one way the way that I always look at it is if you, for example, take the word chelate, and it's not very well known this, but I think as soon as everybody knows this, it will never lose your mind. It's the Greek word chele, from which it is derived, which means lobster claw. Why is it lobster claw? Because a chelate basically surrounds a metal like a lobster claw would attach to something like food. And that is the main reason why chelates are called chelates, because they are derived from this lobster claw principle. The reason why they are so stable is exactly that, because they fully surround the metal, meaning that the complex is less likely to fall apart. Now, oftentimes people then ask me the question, isn't it bound too strongly? In these particular cases for the organics that are being offered commercially, that's not the case. Because one has to realize that the transporter system that's present in the gastrointestinal tract is obviously a system that's been developed by Mother Nature over a lot of years, and it managed to perfect it actually quite sophisticated, because the transporters that are present are pulling on these metals much more strongly than what you would commonly see with regards to the complex and the mineral/metal itself.
So the affinity for the transporter and to be transported out of the gastrointestinal tract and into the portal vein is pretty strong.
Yes, yeah. You're talking 10 to the power 12 to 10 to the power 14, whereas these organic ligands are closer to the 10 to the power 2. So it's a multifold difference.
Okay, fascinating. I had no idea about that. Okay, so then once those trace minerals are absorbed out of the gastrointestinal tract, we now have them in the single trace mineral format, and their metabolism is quite the same then, Gavin?
Yes, yeah. As soon as a metal is transported into the gastrointestinal cell and from there on onwards into the portal vein towards the liver, they're all handled more or less the same. And I think that shows you how sophisticated the system is, because within there, the body has quite some levers to pull, where it can change whether or not absorption efficiency is high or absorption efficiency is low. Because one of the things you should always remember is that while trace minerals are essential for human life, they're also a large threat, because their relative level of, let's say, toxicity in comparison to how much of it you need can be very low.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's very important to remind people that there are things that all terrestrial mammals consume in extraordinarily small amounts, but are still needed for life and should not be deleted from the diet. Now, once we have all those minerals in the peripheral system, then and available for all the tissues, can you maybe go through a little bit about how then mineral status is regulated? And maybe to highlight, you mentioned earlier, we talked a little bit about requirements, and of course, metabolism and requirements are intimately related. So maybe use a couple of examples for the listeners when that status would be challenged and how that regulation would change and the requirements might change as well.
Yeah, so the system is very sophisticated, meaning that they can adapt very, very largely to what is needed. There are multifold ways by which the animal can adapt. One of the simplest ways is by the internal storages that they have of minerals. So, for example, zinc can be stored in bone tissue, and can then be used later on when, for example, intake of zinc is reduced. And remarkably, some studies actually show that this bone turnover can happen independently, or this release of zinc can happen independently from bone turnover. So again, it shows how sophisticated the system is. On top of that, the absorption efficiency within the gastrointestinal tract can be changed. So the body can express either higher or lower amounts of a transporter, meaning that the efficiency by which it is absorbed out of the intestinal tract is reduced. And next to that, as soon as a trace metal is then absorbed into the endothelial cell, it can actually increase the expression of a protein called metallothionein, which binds to a metal so strongly it basically keeps it within that gut cell. And because a gut cell lives relatively short, 3 to 5 days, when that cell dies, it actually is an excretion mechanism of that metal that was just absorbed. Next to that, and that's the final system, as I like to call it, within the liver, this same metallothionein can be expressed, thereby retaining that metal within the liver rather than getting it distributed throughout the body. So again, I'm always amazed when I consider all these different variety of ways by which the body can respond and how sophisticated this system operates.
Yeah, a question for you too, and maybe here, trace minerals ever included in electrolyte solutions as well?
So they are actually very important for membrane permeability and electrolyte balance within the body. So yes, they play a huge role there too.
So then about the control of urinary excretion of the trace minerals as well?
So what is seen is if you inject, for example, high amounts of trace metals, one of the first thing from an excretion point of view that happens is excretion of these metals through urine. So high influx of metal will actually lead to an increased urinary excretion as a defense mechanism.
Right. So the body, I always remind people that we're well developed on almost every species on the planet at this point in evolution to be able to handle both deficits and surfeits for a period of time. Some things more than others, some things less. But I agree with you. Very fascinating, all the mechanisms there to enhance or to support trace mineral status. So then, if we think about animals, and I know that we're going to have to rely on other model species in this case, probably pigs and chickens, and maybe some aquatic species if we're thinking about the cat as a carnivore, although maybe fish do minerals differently. Fish are interesting in a whole different way as a model animal. But let's maybe start off with which physiological stages where would you expect for trace mineral requirements to be greater?
So for sure, younger animals will have higher relative requirements for minerals. They're in a part of their life where there's so much development going on. At the same time, they're also in a part of their life where, for example, their immune system isn't fully properly developed. And one must realize that trace minerals are, especially in an immune compromised scenario, vital for the body to properly defend itself. So in those particular animals, it's very important to at least meet their requirements because their requirements will be higher. Now, when you take older animals, in those particular cases as well, metal or mineral requirements become relatively speaking higher, and obviously the adaptability of the system starts to go down, which means that they're more susceptible to deficiencies as well. And the same holds true for humans, and a lot of people oftentimes forget that. But also in humans, in the elderly population, we see these trace mineral deficits quite often, even though they're nutritionally speaking eating decent. It's just that the adaptability of the system starts to go down, which is why there's a higher likelihood of seeing that deficiency there.
Yeah. Unfortunately, aging leads to all kinds of losses of those efficiencies that all animals have in the prime of their life. So, but we definitely need a lot more information on the aging process and whether we can change some of those mechanisms. So, does that mean with the old animals as well, because they have reduced adaptability, are we not just concerned about potential deficits, but are they likely also more sensitive to potential toxic levels of the trace minerals as well?
So one of the problems, especially on the toxicity side, that we are dealing with is underlying diseases that we are unaware of. As I indicated to or alluded to earlier, the liver plays a vital role in trace mineral homeostasis, but that also means that if there is any problem with the liver, that system basically doesn't operate or function as well as it maybe should. And in those particular cases, like you say, either in a deficit or in a deficient or in overfeeding state, in those two cases, if there are underlying diseases, there is a higher likelihood that problems arise. And then there, I would say the older an animal is, the more likely it is that there are underlying diseases that we are not yet aware of, which can then lead to these cases.
Okay, well, I don't want to put you on the spot too much on this one, but what I'm dying to ask you about is some of the thoughts around the inclusion of copper in dog foods right now. Would you mind giving us your at least current perspective on copper supply in dog foods?
Yeah. So one of the problems that people are talking about nowadays are the effects of copper, with copper toxicity becoming, according to literature, or not necessarily literature, but to a lot of people, it's becoming more and more present. And one thing that everybody is seeing is that we're basically over supplementing copper. nowadays, which means that in the long run, that leads to potentially problems with these animals due to the fact that they suffer from copper toxicity. Now, there, in my opinion, different reasons underneath this. One of them being obviously the genetic differences that are present. What we commonly see is that copper toxicity usually is a result of like an inherent metabolic defect, which is present in particular breeds. We see it, for example, in Bedlington Terriers or in Labradors. And in those particular cases, we know that they're recessive genes responsible or, let's say, involved in trace mineral homeostatic regulation, which are affected, which then lead to, let's say, the adaptability of the system being reduced. And in those particular cases, it's not necessarily the amount of copper or the type of copper that is being fed that is the problem, but it's the underlying disease. There's a study which is a little older. It was done in the 90s, where they looked at a wide variety of breeds. And I think close to 350, 400 dogs were looked at and to look at what their copper levels were from a liver perspective. And they saw that the levels of copper in these animals ranged very widely from 100 ppm of dry matter all the way to 6,800. But when you look at their hepatic levels, 40% of those animals were actually below, let's say, 500 ppm dry matter liver, which basically shows that even though there's such a wide range of copper levels that were present in the commercial dog foods, their hepatic levels were still below that threshold for a large fraction of those dogs. In other words, again, there's such a flexibility with this system that they can deal with a wide variety or a wide range of copper. Now, one of the statements that then sometimes is made is that the premixes, or the copper that is added to the diets, not necessarily the copper of the raw materials, is responsible for that. And then for that, I go back to the very beginning of our discussion. When we take into consideration the adaptability of the system and the different sources of trace minerals that we can feed, when we take a trace mineral source where something is complexed so strongly to a organic ligand, if the body has no intention of absorbing said trace mineral, it won't absorb said trace mineral because it's complex to a ligand. And it doesn't necessarily want to let go of that metal if there is no transporter on the other end pulling it. And in those particular cases, my argument there would be that if you do think that there is risk for copper toxicity, then one of the mistakes you should not make is reduce, let's say, the premix copper, or at least not the organic copper, for an inorganic copper, which sometimes people do. And that has to do, it's partly the fault of the industry, where we always talk about bioavailability of these different trace mineral sources. But one has to take into consideration that bioavailability, to a large extent, I would argue 70%, is driven by the animal. And in those particular cases, there are plenty of studies by Wedekind, studies by Eckert, but also during my PhD, I've done those studies where we actually see bioavailability of organic sources being lower than inorganic sources. And that happens as soon as we start to feed them above requirements. In other words, these organic sources, when we feed below requirements, have higher availability, but when we feed above requirements, have lower availability. In short, we are allowing the body to better control absorption or be more efficient towards regulating its absorption.
Okay, so I think it's a really important point, Gavin, and I just want to repeat it for you too, is that if you are a pet food manufacturer or formulator and you are concerned about copper toxicity because you're dealing with breeds or life stages that might be more prone to having difficulty regulating copper status, your choice in this case should always be the proteinate and rarely be the inorganic.
Yes. Yeah. Because the inorganic is more likely to fall apart, thereby leading to a larger amount of free soluble metal. and a free soluble metal is more likely to leak through than a complex or chelated mineral is.
Right. Okay. So interesting. So on these notes of really starting to understand requirements, and then whenever we look at requirements, we usually look at a breadth of intakes of whatever the test nutrient is. When you're thinking about looking at mineral requirements, what outcomes, let's maybe start with outcomes, and then I'm going to chase a couple other things from you in terms of design principles. But in terms of outcomes, what kind of outcomes would you be pursuing to define the requirement for a trace mineral?
So this is always the first question when you start to design these trials. And obviously, it's highly dependent on the species that you are using. What I mean by that is if you're using, let's start with the easiest one, rats or mice, the opportunities or the options are endless. If you go to broilers or swine, there's still plenty of options. While if you go to companion animals or dogs and cats, the options are more limited. The most common ones that are being used are either skeletal tissue, liver tissue, or blood tissue. And then you can basically look at blood as being an indicator of, at the moment, trace mineral status, because it's a highly adaptable metric or matrix. Whereas if you go to bone skeletal, so bone tissue, it tells you more about the long-term homeostatic regulation or trace mineral status. But then there are also cases where people are looking at the trace mineral content in hair tissue, for example. And I think that's an opportunity that maybe for a companion animal can be something. Although blood for a companion animal, if possible, is still a very good metric. But then consideration has to be taken with regards to the fact that it's more of a short-term marker than it is a long-term marker. But those are usually the best ones. Now, performance indicators should always be taken along. But one thing to take into consideration is that performance, it's a very lagging indicator because with regards to trace minerals, if you have subclinical toxicity or subclinical deficiency or subclinical toxicity, it's all in the word, it's subclinical. In other words, you won't see it, which is why these serum or bone tissue markers are much better than performance because performance drops at a later stage than deficiency actually happens.
ICC Animal Nutrition, a Brazilian company with 30 years of history and present in more than 70 different countries, providing natural, sustainable, and technological solutions for animal nutrition, health, and well-being in a safe and scientific way, adding value in food production and helping to feed the world.
Yeah, and of course, our major limitation in dog and cat research as well is none of us want to supply any nutrients below requirement for a length of time that we know it'll cause deleterious effects on the animal, whether laboratory animals or client-owned animals. So having changes, for example, in bone mineral content is not where we want to go. We want to do shorter term studies using mineral content of the blood rather than something far more invasive like bone. But I agree with you. You know that I also enjoy skin and coat health, and you were talking about hair. I've recently asked some students to pursue what skin scrapings could get us and whether we could get enough sample on a skin scraping to understand content of amino acids and trace minerals in the skin as well. So we constantly have to think about new things that we can pursue as well while we're trying to optimize the research we do so we can get the best results that we can. So that's an idea about research outcomes. But if you're talking to clients, and we can overlay a million factors here, but if companies are receiving calls from consumers, how might they link how dogs that are eating their foods, and it combines everything. And so I always remind people to nutrients aren't required on a dietary basis, they're required on an animal basis. So we always talk about the composition of the diet, but if dogs and cats don't eat enough of the diet, none of it really matters.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so it might not be. So what I'm trying to say for the pet food industry as well, it might not be your fault. People may be feeding not enough of your diet to maintain, for example, trace mineral delivery to meet requirements. But what might be some of the clinical signs of a trace mineral deficiency?
Yeah. So clinical signs of a trace mineral deficiency, they can express themselves in different ways. One of the, I think, most common ones is that you see a reduction of feed intake, which obviously leads to a cycle because you have a reduction of trace minerals, which leads to a lower intake of feed, which then leads to even less mineral being available. So that's a cycle that for sure you want to break. But that's one of the most common clinical deficiencies. In most cases and for most minerals, you won't really see that. And that's the tricky thing with these trace minerals. They have a tendency of staying within this subclinical deficiency state. And in those particular cases, you won't notice anything until requirements go up. Now, when do requirements go up? When an animal is being challenged. So think immunity. If an animal gets sick and it's already suffering from subclinical deficiency, then basically you can see that they get more sick because it takes their body takes longer to properly respond to these infections. So that's also a very common way, I would say, to which you can indicate that there's something going on from a subclinical deficiency point of view.
Yeah, and definitely the reason why many of us are trying to figure out models of stress that are acceptable to apply to cats and dogs to determine this, which is no small feat
No.
as well. So really interesting. So maybe as we're kind of coming to a close, because for the listeners too, your colleague Taylor Hansen was on the Pet Food Science podcast recently. So I was trying to build on some of the things that she discussed from the perspective of our colleagues at Trouw, Nutrico, Salco, Shredding, all of the companies that fall under your umbrella. I guess maybe one of the last questions as to trace minerals is, you mentioned at the beginning the hydroxy minerals, and I was wondering if you can give a little bit of a teaser text to when the pet food industry may be able to also consider these in the formulation of their diets.
Yeah, so hydroxy trace minerals are a little bit different. And the main difference that they have is that because they don't have an organic ligand, they can be loaded with a higher percentage of metal, which basically means that you get more metal for the same amount of product, which from a formulation perspective obviously opens up space within the premix, which allows you to add different things. But at the same time, from a cost perspective, it also means that they're more cost efficient. Now, we actually have markets where we're using these products in the pet food premixes. And in most of those cases, they are being used in the economy lines because the threshold from a pricing perspective between the inorganics and the hydroxys, in this particular case, IntelliBond, is less steep. Which means that the transition, especially in these economy lines, so the more cost-conscious lines, is easier to make. So it's there, but for the economy lines more so than for the sub-premium and premium lines.
Okay, fantastic. And if we have any listeners that have anybody in their organization that's interested in talking to the experts at Trouw Nutrition about trace minerals, how do they get in contact with you and your colleagues?
Well, obviously, everybody that listens to this will know my name. So one of the easiest ways to go about it is to go on LinkedIn and look me up and ask the questions through there. But at the same time, through our websites, either through Trouw USA, Selco, you can obviously shoot us a message with any question that you might have. And me, as well as my other colleagues, are more than happy to answer any of these questions and have the discussion that you and I are currently having with you as well.
Yeah, I know that we're trying to cover kind of everybody's needs, but of course, you'll have the same length discussion with people about their particular needs and their diet philosophy and their targets and whatnot. So really important. So my very last question, because as I think most people know now, I have a fondness for the Dutch. Really enjoyed my time in the Netherlands, but it is North America is a very different working culture than the Netherlands is. And while we always talk about how to work with the Dutch, what advice would you give to the Dutch working with North Americans?
Well, one of the things that we, as Dutch, have a tendency of doing is speaking our mind before we think, which to some other cultures can be seen as blunt. But I think one thing you should always realize and look at it from a positive way. If you interact with a Dutch person, at least the answer that you're getting is going to be close to his real opinion, his or her, which I think for me is a very comfortable feeling. Because when I ask a question, I at least upfront already know that the answer that I'm going to get is the truth. So my suggestion would be is don't shy away from asking the direct questions, but then at the same time, brace yourself for the honest answer that's coming towards you. But that's probably the best advice I can give you. Yes, it might be blunt, but keep in mind that at least they're being honest.
Absolutely. I think that I would absolutely concur with you. I think that's absolutely the truth in my experience with the Dutch that I've worked with in North America, but then the Dutch society as well, I felt operated in that exact same way. So with that, Gavin, thank you so much for your time today. I know that I learned a lot, and I hope to have you back because I think that there's a much deeper dive that needs to be taken, especially on trace minerals and mineral nutrition for the pet food industry and where we need to go with research. So with that, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed having this discussion. And by all means, to all the listeners, if you want to have this discussion or have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Great. Thank you.